Thank you, everyone, for joining this afternoon as we launch a new series from Columbia's Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy. And the title of the new series is The History and Future of Planetary Threats. Let me begin by recognizing several people. Wilmot James, the senior research scholar at the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy, has taken the lead in organizing this series. Alex Halliday, who is director of the Earth Institute, a great scientist and also helping lead the establishment of a new School of Climate at Columbia. And our guest, Ernest Moniz, the former United States Secretary of Energy and co-chair and CEO of Nuclear Threat Initiative, and of course, a great colleague. And welcome all of our distinguished panelists. It feels like, and we are, at a time of great reckoning in the world. There are extreme and very consequential threats that are now materializing and occurring with some regularity. And of course, the major one at the moment is the pandemic. So the question is, of course, how to help prevent these threats to the extent we can, and how to cope to the extent we cannot. So universities, of course, have a major role to play, and one of increasing importance. Governments sometimes fail to deal with threats in the world and events of great significance. Sometimes they even impede, as I think has happened in recent years. Even when governments are great and good, as when Secretary Moniz was in office, there's still a very important role for universities to play. And of course, we do important work in discovering new knowledge and ideas, and we engage with the world in a variety of ways. But there is a great question about whether universities need to become more actively involved in some ways in the world, given the changes that are occurring and that are now the subjects of this series. I have to say that the experts and scholars we have across the United States and across the world in the fields of public health and medicine and science have acquitted themselves with great distinction in this most recent period of crisis of the pandemic. So I'm very grateful to Wilmot James for the work he's done to bring this series to life, for the contributions of Alex Halliday and the Earth Institute in assembling this event and those that will follow. And I really want to extend a very special thanks to United States Secretary of Energy, Ernest Moniz, as he offers his thoughts on the nuclear challenges of today and what more we can do to address them. So please join me in welcoming Wilmot James and Alex Halliday, who will tell you more about the series and introduce Dr. Moniz. Thank you.
Thank you very much to President Bolliger, to Lee, for his introductory remarks and his support for what it is we are doing, and to thank our partners at the Earth Institute, the programs in global health at the Bachelor's College of Physicians and Surgeons, as well as the Academy of Political Science. Before I introduce my co-moderator, Alex Halliday, the series, and Dr. Moniz, I would like to turn to Harlow Wang to please review the Zoom etiquette for today.
Thank you, Dr. James, and welcome to this panel, everyone. We do welcome audience questions. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a button called Q&A with some speech bubbles. Please feel free to put questions in there at any time. You also have the opportunity to upvote or to like questions from other attendees, and those we'll see at the top of our screens and hope to be able to answer those questions that many of you want to see answered. We will have an audience question and answer period towards the end of the session, but please put your questions in the question and answer box throughout the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Harlow. So to introduce Alex Halliday, who is the director of Columbia University's Earth Institute, and he was previously the Dean of Science and Engineering at Oxford University. Alex has been a pioneer, as many of you know, in developing mass spectrometry and to measure small isotopic variations, helping to shed light on the birth and early development of our solar system, the interior workings of the Earth, and the processes that affect the Earth's surface environment. Secondly, to introduce our series, which we launched today, titled The History and Future of Planetary Threats. These are convenings to consider catastrophic risks and hazards in the following domains: geological, biological, environmental, chemical, extreme weather, radiological, and nuclear, or combinations of these. By catastrophic, we understand to mean classes of events that can lead to sudden, extraordinary, widespread disaster beyond the collective capacity of national and international organizations and the private sector to control, causing severe disruptions in normal social functioning, heavy tolls in morbidity and mortality, and major economic losses. In some events that may well cause a change in the direction of history. Nuclear, of course, falls into a class of its own because it can result in the annihilation of life on planet Earth and the end of history as we know it. It is therefore appropriate to launch these convenings with a focus on nuclear, and there can be no better expert, both from the point of view of the subject matter as well as policymaker, than our guest speaker today, Dr. Ernie Moniz. He is, as you know, the former US Secretary of Energy, and currently is the Chief Executive Officer and co-chair of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, a global organization, security organization working to reduce nuclear and biological threats. As the 13th US Secretary of Energy, he advanced nuclear technology innovation, nuclear security, cutting-edge scientific research, and environmental stewardship. Dr. Moniz previously served in government as the Department of Energy Undersecretary and Associate Director for Science in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Dr. Moniz served on the Massachusetts Institute of Technology faculty and is the Cecil and Ida Green Professor of Physics and Engineering Systems Emeritus, as well as serving as Special Advisor to the MIT President. He's also a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Harvard University's Belfer Center and President and CEO of Energy Futures Initiative. Dr. Moniz received a Bachelor of Science degree, summa cum laude, in physics from Boston College and a doctorate in theoretical physics from Stanford University. If I can start the conversation by posing the following question to Dr. Moniz. In the publication with Senator Sam Nunn in Foreign Affairs titled The Return to Doomsday, the new nuclear arms race and how Washington and Moscow could stop it, which I found to be the most sober assessment of heightened nuclear security peril that we face today. You make a distinction there between what you term strategic stability and strategic instability. And you observe that during our current threat environment of strategic instability, an accident, a blunder, and a miscalculation can easily set up a cataclysm. You highlight a number of related risk-related factors, but the one that struck me was where you say that, and I quote, communication channels have closed down between the US and Russia, and that there is, quote, no ongoing NATO-Russian crisis management dialogue. Could you please elaborate on this and spell out the history of ongoing communication channels and why it is so monumentally vital to have these, especially during periods of political tension and conflict?
Well, thank you, Wilmot. That's a very broad question to start with, but let me also thank Lee and Alex, in fact, and also all three of you for this invitation to discuss these, or to launch this Planetary Threats series. With regard to the U.S.-Russia relationship, I think you've actually summarized many of the principal arguments. The fact is that if we go back to the Cold War, let's go back to the Reagan administration in the 80s. While we had enormous differences with the Soviet Union, and those played out across the globe, the reality is both the United States and the Soviet Union adhered to the idea that we had a joint responsibility, because of our overwhelming nuclear arsenals, to always maintain the kinds of dialogue. And I don't mean here, just like a Reagan-Gorbachev dialogue. I mean what I would call the professional dialogues going on at the diplomatic and military-to-military levels that would always seek stability, seek understanding, more precisely perhaps avoid misunderstanding that could lead to a cataclysmic outcome. Even with that, we were very lucky in dodging the bullet several times with misinformation reaching one or the other presidents, and that in a context where the decision time for a massive exchange of nuclear warheads is very, very short. The president, in reality, has perhaps 10 minutes to respond. So the risks were great. There were basically two adversaries taking the responsibility of managing the risks quite seriously. I think if you look now today, many of those elements are missing. First of all, the level of dialogue has gone down. You mentioned, for example, the NATO-Russia crisis management. Well, that mechanism was put in place so that if there were a flashpoint, a hot issue between NATO and Russia, there would be an established dialogue or place of dialogue where hopefully one could walk down those risks. Instead, what happened in the Ukraine incursion in early 2014 was that, quotes, as a punishment, that channel was cut off. That's exactly when we needed it. That's why it was put in place, was to address those risks. Instead, we somehow are treating dialogue as a reward, as opposed to a diplomatic tool. So the level of communication, while the relationship between our countries is very, very bad, while we have our militaries operating in close proximity in several cases, what we say is that the risk of something bad happening and then escalating has increased. That's why we say that, frankly, we think the risks right now are higher than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But we would distinguish here that the risk of initiation, we think, is far more likely to be a misunderstanding, a blunder, a miscalculation, as opposed to kind of a willful, planned major nuclear attack. So that's the condition. We say we are sleepwalking towards strategic instability. In both countries, nuclear weapons are more and more being viewed as another battlefield weapon. This is an accident waiting to happen.
You wrote Return to Doomsday before the recent elections. You make a strong case for developing a new and stronger mutual deterrence architecture at all levels, no matter who is leading and who is in charge. But now we have in the United States a deeply troubled and compromised transition with dual centers of power emerging. How do you suggest the world deals with this? What actions can be taken to minimize the peril we face? You mentioned a new diplomacy. What is the new diplomacy that's required to set us on the right path to strategic stability?
Well, I think there are a number of things that the new Biden administration can do. I'm not saying that there's a magic wand, but frankly, that what you call diplomacy, we view as starting at home. The reality is, if we do not get back to a much more nonpartisan approach to these kinds of issues of catastrophic risk, we are exposing ourselves precisely to those risks. So, for example, Sam Nunn and I propose, as one example, reconstituting a body similar to that which existed in the 1980s. Again, when I mentioned that period of at least trying to manage these risks actively, there was an arms control observer group put together. At that time, it was the Senate with the Reagan administration, and in particular with the Secretary of State, George Shultz, who I might observe will be soon celebrating his 100th birthday. Anyway, that was a group that it was bipartisan. It had regular briefings and discussions with the administration about what was happening, for example, in arms control. And that was that helped, first of all, pave the way for things like Senate confirmation of agreements, because they were there on the takeoff and not just on the landing. But it also gave greater confidence to the negotiations, in particular, in that case, to the Soviets, because they recognized that the two parties in the United States, the administration and the Congress, were together in the negotiations. So we advocate forming a similar group today, probably bicameral, including both the House and the Senate, with the administration. That the idea there is, very critically, it would provide the political space for the negotiations with Russia, space that frankly does not exist today, with both parties being very suspect of any discussions. So creating that political space allows the discussions, again, at the diplomatic level, at the military level, to be ongoing and to increase stability. Now, there are other things which, of course, the administration will do. One that they have announced already is that that the Biden administration will accept Russia's offer to extend the New START treaty for 5 years, as it is. The New START treaty, as I'm sure most know, is essentially the last remaining pillar of the arms control architecture. It's the last remaining agreement that provides for mutual verification levels, as well as capping deployed weapons and delivery systems. But we would suggest perhaps that a new administration go a little bit farther. The negotiations will be very tough, by the way, in those 5 years, because they need to expand to new kinds of weapon systems, to so-called tactical weapons, which have always been an issue, and frankly, uncomfortable for the United States, onto the defensive side as well, namely missile defense, which has been a major issue since the United States withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty early in this century. So I would say join New START. And now this is not the president-elect. This is us at NTI. We've discussed, well, how about making at the same time, on the United States side, a unilateral gesture to, let's say, over a year, moderately decrease the ceiling from 1550 to 1400, but invite Russia then, of course, to make a reciprocal action. So trust building exercises of this type, which can also condition the negotiations. I would advocate, and my colleagues at NTI would advocate, that the president-elect, or the new President Biden, in his first 100 days or so, should make a major integrative speech on nuclear policy, similar to what Obama did in March of 2009 in Prague, to really lay out an agenda and, frankly, assert some leadership globally for risk reduction. Clearly, we need a strong recommitment to the NPT, to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has a review conference coming up in the first half of next year. And that commitment includes the commitment to eventually eliminate nuclear weapons, a tough task. I would just observe 2045 has a nice ring to it as a goal, since that would be 1 century of the existence of nuclear weapons. There are many, many other things, but let me mention a couple of others. One is that President Biden could voluntarily move towards putting guardrails around the sole authority of the President of the United States to utilize nuclear weapons. We do not think that that's a very stable situation. Something that provides more deliberation would be important. But of course, that would be encouraged if one could go back to an issue I mentioned earlier, namely increased decision time. We think the president, together with President Putin, should direct their militaries and their diplomats to work on increasing decision time from the 10 minutes to something that's much more rational in terms of making sure that data, for example, that's coming in is correct. So we think that we should have negative security assurances without caveats that we would not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. And maybe that can be expanded to a uniform commitment among the P5, so including China, the UK, and France. There's a list that I could go on, Wilmot, but I think there's about at least a dozen or so very sensible steps that could be taken through executive action early in the Biden presidency. But of course, executive action, just to circle back to the beginning of this answer, executive action would be on much firmer ground if something like that bipartisan group had been established between the Congress and the administration, so that, again, the political space is expanded, including for the president.
So thank you very much, Dr. Moniz. Thank you, Annie. If I can now invite Alex Halliday to put some issues to you.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to, this is fascinating. I just wanted to broaden things a little bit, though, Annie, with a bit of a discussion about nuclear capability more generally. And in particular, how strong do you think the US is these days in terms of nuclear engineering, given that there are big advances being made in a number of countries around nuclear reactors and how to actually, advance nuclear energy. The US doesn't seem to have so much of a plan of action that seems well focused, and that could be, it's of course anecdotal, but I'd be keen to hear what you think and whether you think, given the sort of decline of nuclear engineering in many universities as a subject, you think there's cause for concern in terms of our capability more broadly.
So let me first answer a question, Alex, that you didn't ask, because I want to make sure there's clarity here. In terms of stewardship of the nuclear weapons stockpile, I think the performance of the United States enterprise, and this means, of course, particularly the so-called weapons labs, Los Alamos, Livermore, and Sandia, has really brought enormous scientific creativity to the task, which is why we are, 30 years, almost 30 years beyond nuclear testing, and every year are able to certify, as I had to do when I was Secretary of Energy, certify the safety and reliability of the stockpile without testing.
Mhm.
It's not fully appreciated, I think, the extent of the scientific and technological evolution that was required to do that. I'd be happy to go into that, but let me instead turn to your question.
I know a bit about it already. Anyway, so that's very helpful there.
In terms of the nuclear energy enterprise, which does have major implications for our security posture and for the global nonproliferation regime, I'm afraid what you said is, on the one hand, correct, but I'll offer some hope. What is correct is that what you would call the nuclear technology supply chain in the United States is not in very good shape. That has we hadn't built any nuclear reactors in a long time. There was a large drop in university nuclear engineering student interest, a particular domestic student interest. And today, I think we still suffer from that lack of a supply chain. Let me give you an example with security consequences, and then I'll come back to the good news. And then the good news will be followed by some more not so good news. But for example, today, the United States has no capability whatsoever with domestically developed technology to enrich uranium. Why is that important? Well, for national security applications, first of all, you need, because of non-proliferation agreements, you need a domestic technology. What would you do with it? Well, you would make uranium fuel, typical low enriched uranium fuel for nuclear reactors, or today the one nuclear reactor, eventually probably the two nuclear reactors, in which by TVA does this. TVA is a government agency. They manufacture tritium, which is obviously a relatively short half-life component of nuclear weapons. We do not have the capability to do that. We are living off of stockpiles. We are living off of stockpiles of enriched uranium. Those stockpiles will run out. That's just one example of how a supply chain is not there to support the nuclear security needs. Now, in terms of nuclear energy, I think it's the reverse. We have today the greatest burst of innovation in new nuclear energy technologies, both fission and fusion, than we have ever had. I think we are seeing not only the light water technologies, but as we go to these small modular reactors, 50 to 200 megawatts, or even the micro reactors, typically 1 to 10 megawatts, what we are seeing is we are seeing some of, but certainly not by any means exclusively, the traditional light water reactor technology. So there's really a lot more thinking about molten salt and gas reactors and micro reactors with new applications, and this is generating enormous student interest. And I'll just mention on the fusion side as well. In fact, MIT has a prominent spin-out called Commonwealth. There are others. For full disclosure, I'm on the board of one of the privately funded fusion companies, a different one, TAE it's called, which is looking for aneutronic fusion, making tremendous progress, very, very exciting. Obviously, if there is a breakthrough in some of these smaller modular fusion plants, that would be a game changer for addressing climate. So that's really tremendous. Now, on the slightly less positive side, which you alluded to, we have not yet reached the kind of public-private partnership that is needed to get one or ideally more of these novel technologies to the serious demonstration phase. Because the reality is, you get into the nuclear business, as you know, you're not talking 100 million anymore. You're talking billions, and I think we're going to need some kind of a dedicated private-public way of getting over the hump. So,
Right.
but still, it's a whole different world. I might add now, to close the loop back to the nuclear security side, and at NTI we have a major new thrust on global nuclear fuel cycles to avoid proliferation risks, particularly with enrichment and reprocessing plants, that if we do not have the technology that everybody else wants, it's very difficult for us to continue to be the leader in establishing strong non-proliferation norms in our in nuclear commerce. So these things all really are linked together, and I think the most exciting thing in the end is this burst of innovation in terms of new nuclear technologies.
That's great. I was just wondering, I mean, I've only got a couple more minutes, but and so the final question I was going to ask you is, how do you sleep at night? But I thought the penultimate question is kind of related to that, and that's cyber threats. How much of a concern are cyber threats? I mean, there must be a massive concern, but how resilient do you feel we are in terms of thinking through potential cyber threats inside nuclear facilities, which, I mean, all you need is a flash drive and you just stick it in the computer. You don't actually need to do it through the internet. How do you actually secure the future of our nuclear capability in America in particular?
Yeah, Alex, let me say that question is really part of a broader question, in my view. We'll come back to cyber specifically, but the reality is there are so many technology evolutions that challenge the traditional paradigm of how the whole nuclear system is put together, including the policies. I mean, frankly, you know, the game theoretic deterrence policy put in place, I don't know, in the 1960, kind of when you fundamentally had only two real nuclear powers, technology was very, very different. It needs a very serious relook, with technology being a big driver. So cyber is one, but I would mention as well, the militarization of space is practically completely unregulated.
Yeah.
There's many issues as to many concerns about how will artificial intelligence be put into the command and control system for nuclear weapons. Most of us certainly feel very strongly that we cannot go to a so-called dead hand, where, you know, some machine decides to launch a nuclear weapon, et cetera. There is things like the hypersonic technologies that President Putin was pleased to advertise, although Russia is by no means the only country to be developing hypersonic delivery systems. So there's many of these. Cyber is certainly one of the major concerns, specifically the risk that early warning systems and command and control systems could be compromised. It's not that somebody is going to, I don't think somebody's going to kind of have a cyber direction to shoot off an ICBM. It's much more the issue of the information space that could lead a president to make the wrong decision. And the military is very, very concerned about that. We at NTI will soon have a new report coming out that looks at the question of digitization and cybersecurity in the entire modernization program. So again, the United States, as well as Russia and China, but I'll focus on the United States, is in the early stages of a controversial, but like roughly $1.5 trillion modernization of the nuclear weapon system. What we have, and the argument for that is fairly clear. We're going to have nuclear weapons for decades more. And we haven't modernized in a long, long time. For example, as an aside, because you were asking about sleeping at night. When I was Secretary of Energy, one of the reasons I didn't sleep well at night was concerned about having nuclear weapons workers, especially at the uranium facility in Oak Ridge, working high hazard operations in 1950s and 1960s buildings. It is known that ceilings fell down internally. So the idea that you can't keep going on the cheap, roughly speaking, with these facilities when you're dealing with nuclear weapons. On the other hand, $1.5 trillion. There are questions about whether one needs to do this whole program. But my point with regard to your question is, clearly when you modernize, you don't put back the same old analog devices. So there will be massive digitization, and the concerns is one opening up any back doors, for example, to cyber threats in the modernization process. So it's a complicated issue, and you're right to put your finger on that as a big issue. Of course, I could also say the same thing for commercial plants, but maybe enough said.
Thanks a lot. Back to Wilmot.
Thank you very much. If I could now invite our panelists to contribute, and if I can start off by introducing Robert Jervis, who is the Adlai Stevenson Professor of International Affairs at Columbia University, and who's a specialist in international politics in general and security policy, decision-making, and theories of conflict and cooperation in particular. His Why Intelligence Fails, Lessons from the Iranian Revolution and the Iraq War was published by Cornell University Press in April of 2010. So over to you, Robert.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Secretary Moniz, for the very interesting introduction to the really complicated subject. I want to make sort of come at it in two slightly different ways. The first is really the optimistic point that paradoxically, avoiding nuclear war is a lot easier than avoiding war. Because throughout history, ask, why did countries fight? They thought they could win. Often they did win. To take just a contemporary example, the small but rather bloody war between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the Karabakh, clearly, at least in the short run, this paid off for Azerbaijan, just the way about it was 20 years ago, it paid off for Armenia. So, in wars in the pre-nuclear era, sometimes they turned out to be mutually disastrous, but often they didn't. And so that makes avoiding war very hard. Now, with at least bilateral nuclear wars, it's hard to imagine a leader being so blind as to think that we can get away with it without getting our hair mussed. Some of us old enough to remember Dr. Strangelove know the line. Mm-hmm. So the understanding that this is, in a sense, the game of chicken, that is where the worst outcome for both sides is a war, on the one hand makes avoiding a war, I won't say easy, but it brings it in the realm of feasibility that really has not been true about avoiding war historically. Of course, there are two others, if you will, this is a coin with three sides. The most obvious other side of the coin is that if there is a war, the consequences are horrible for everyone, unimaginable. Charles de Gaulle said, in the event of a war, nuclear war, there'd be at the end neither tombs nor churches, nor museums, nor any culture. She said it better, that said it in French, but it's that residual fear that on the one hand produces the peace, but on the other hand, if it weren't some probability that this would occur, it wouldn't have the pacifying effect. The third hand, which really complicates it, and some of Secretary Moniz's remarks got at that, is that each side can use the possibility of great danger, and even in the end, things getting out of control in a war, as a competitive lever. As Herman Kahn, often maligned, again in Dr. Strangelove and others, said, in nuclear bargaining, each side says to the other, one of us has to be reasonable, and it's not going to be me. And so this sets up incentives not to be reasonable in order to get competitive advantage. In this situation, I think, in terms of general ways out of the thickets, I think there are two different, not necessarily conflicting, but still quite different approaches that countries have followed. And Secretary Moniz hinted at both. One is to caricature that the cause of the danger, especially of the accidental war, are the weapons, especially the warning time. And the danger with hypersonics is not that they're fast, but that they circumvent part of our warning systems. And that weapons configurations which give an offensive advantage, in the sense that if you believe war is coming, you want to strike first rather than second, even if you don't want war, that is what can be terribly dangerous. And classical American arms control policy in the 60s and really through part of the end of the Cold War was based on reducing crisis instability by controlling bad characteristics of weapons. The other, and that's my final point, not inconsistent with it, I think Secretary Moniz is right, we have to do both, is to say the view the Soviets had, and I think the Russians have now, which is, to be a little flip, weapons don't cause war, people do. And that we've never seen a case where the characteristics of weapons have led to the wars. And that a lot of American focus on arms control, and I've participated in it, have been fundamentally misleading. And that the main thrust should be reducing the level of political conflict. You're never going to do away with it, of course. And in this, and this is the final point, I'm fairly optimistic on Russian-American relations. Yes, there are frictions in the Baltic republics and things growing out of Ukraine, but there isn't anything worth a war. In the Cold War, you could argue there was. Now there really isn't. And I think for all the huffing and puffing on both sides, everyone understands that. So in terms of Russian-American relations, between the lack of fundamental overwhelming political conflict, and the fact that everyone knows how disastrous war is, I'm pretty optimistic. A lot of other areas around the world, especially India and Pakistan, different topic, a lot more pessimism. Anyway, thank you for the remarks that I think were very useful.
Wilmot, can I make a few comments in
Absolutely.
response? Or?
Please go ahead. No,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah.
So no, I think what you've said, Robert, is extremely interesting. But I would make a few points. One is the avoiding, how you started with avoiding nuclear war is easier than avoiding war. I think that I would certainly subscribe to that, and frankly, the data support it. During the Cold War, part of our problem is that we are not at all certain that those dynamics continue today because of the miscalculation issues. For example, the cyber discussion we just had, which could be initiated not just by Russia, but by a third party or by a subnational group. And in fact, the whole issue of the potential for terrorism now is very, very different than it was in the Cold War. And that was the main driver of driving the Cold Warriors like Schultz and Kissinger and Perry and Nunn towards their controversial recommendation in terms of phasing out nuclear weapons. And the other comment, there was many things. We should have a sidebar discussion, but I just comment briefly on your last point. But oh, by the way, also let me just say that your point about hypersonics, it's not because they're fast. Absolutely right. People forget that intercontinental missiles, ballistic missiles, are hypersonic. It's just that they do not have the maneuverability and the evasion characteristics, as you say. So I fully agree with that. And by the way, it's interesting that the Russians have stated specifically that they agree that the hypersonic weapons would come under a New START treaty if it were extended. But on the Russia relations, and I continue to maintain a very strong communication channels with the Russian government, for example, as well as civil society. And I have to say, I think you're a little bit on the optimistic side in terms of the U.S.-Russia relationship in general. It's going to take quite a while. I mean, I agree eventually we'll get there, but it's going to take quite a while. However, we have many common interests. And on those interests, there is no reason why we should not be working together to advance those. And I'll give you an example in which I was personally involved. The Iran negotiation. The Iran deal was signed a year and a half, roughly, after the Ukraine incursion. Our relationships were not good. There was also the Syria issue bubbling up, with Russia initiating military action in September of that year, of 2015. However, there was never an issue of us being completely aligned on Iran not having a nuclear weapons program. And frankly, I'll say it flat out, of all the other countries in the negotiation, the E3 EU plus 3, Russia was by far the most helpful in getting the deal done and implemented. And that was when we had tough relations. That's what we need to do in all these areas of catastrophic risk. If we can get the overall relationship across the board greater, by the way, something that might help there is if we allowed a much more robust scientist to scientist kind of collaboration as we used to have. That's been also largely very, very, very seriously cut off. Those are the long-term investments in the relationship. But in the meantime, we got plenty of areas to work together. But instead, we treat, as I said earlier, we treat dialogue as some kind of reward for good behavior. So we need to change this around in a pretty dramatic way. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernie. I mean, there's nothing more fundamental than doing that. And so it's worth emphasizing that. If I can now invite Keren Yarhi-Milo to comment. She's the Arnold Saltzman Professor of War and Peace Studies in the Political Science Department at Columbia and at SIPA. She's also the director of the Arnold Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. Her research and her teaching focus on international relations and foreign policy, with a particular specialization in international security. Over to you, Keren.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Secretary Moniz, for your comments and your remarks. And so we talked a little bit about the, U.S.-Russia. I want to shift to gears to talk maybe a different theater delving a little bit deeper into the US-Iran relationship and the future of the JCPOA. And I'm asking you at this moment for a couple of reasons. First, we have the New York Times reporting from yesterday that Trump was asking advisors about a military option. But even, and hopefully we don't get there and we don't see anything like that, we're talking about a Biden administration, hopefully in mid-January, going back to this, to diplomacy. And then the big question becomes, what should we expect? And given your intimate, one of the architects of the JCPOA, I would love to hear from you, your perspective about a couple of issues. First, it's been almost 5 years that the JCPOA was kind of fully implemented. Since then, the different actors learned different lessons about what worked and didn't work with the agreement. And I wanted to hear from you what those lessons you think are for the different actors. And at the end of the day, where does it put us when we come back to renegotiate the JCPOA? And do you see that it is going to be in the best interest to go back to the same agreement? Or do you think that the accord or any agreement that does not address Iran destabilizing policies in the Middle East is likely to fail, not because of the United States, but because of Israel, the Gulf states, the response from Republicans and some Democrats? So I want to hear your thought about where we are and what lessons do you think the different actors learned. The second thing that I wanted to ask you about is the issue of credibility. We have this problem right now, right, that we didn't have before. Now we have not just the Libya model that nobody wants to talk about and the Libya example, but now we have the issue of credibility of how we behaved with regards to Iran. How much do you think it's going to affect our ability to negotiate nuclear agreements across the board with North Korea, with Iran in the future? So these are the main two questions. I know there's a lot of questions from the audience, and so I'll start with that. Thank you very much.
Let me just, I'll go back to your first question, but let me just note that it's not just Libya and Iran, but there's Paris, there's the World Health Organization, there's the Asian trade agreement. There's many examples to put there, but we'll come back to that. On the first question, I think there's no doubt that there have been different lessons for different people that affect how the Biden administration can go forward. I want to first of all again say that everything I say is my own opinion. It's got nothing to do for what the president-elect is thinking, other than he's made the public statement about re-entering the JCPOA. I think one of the major lessons learned is something that I'll be honest, we in our sideline discussions during the negotiation, I at least I'll speak for myself, pointed out that the Iranians were being very optimistic about the economic rewards that they would have from the JCPOA, and that's when we were fully in the agreement. We had John Kerry and Jack Lew, who was Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury. They were literally flying to London to try to encourage banks to do business with Iran, and basically the banks were not interested. The issue is that, this is actually going to be an optimistic note and maybe Pollyannish, in fact, but I'll make it anyway. The point is the JCPOA did not lift all sanctions by any means. It lifted the nuclear related sanctions. And so you had a situation and by the way, at Columbia, you have an expert on this, Richard Nephew, I would recommend him to you to discuss the sanctions. You had a situation where you still had many sanctions associated with terrorism, with human rights, missiles, etc. You have a situation in which the banking system of Iran was, shall we say, rather rusty in dealing with the international banking system. And you have a situation in Iran in which the Revolutionary Guard is known to have an enormous reach into the economic system. And frankly, we don't even know within about a factor of 2 what that is, except that it's big. And there are all kinds of front companies and everything else. And so the international banking system continued to have major reservations. They were going to be very, very cautious. And the international corporations were happy to sell things, but were not so happy to make big capital investments that could be at risk. So I think one of the lessons through all of this, including with the additional sanctions now being put on, is I think and I hope the Iranians understand that even if we can get back into some kind of condominium to move forward, they got a lot of work to do internally before they can reap the benefits of economic of investment and the like. I think it's a huge, huge lesson. Another lesson, I think, is that the desire of Iran to have an agreement, I think, has been manifest by the, frankly, rather carefully calibrated steps in violation of the nuclear parameters. For example, another bit of recent news was the IAEA saying that Iran now has about 12 times the amount of uranium, enriched uranium, that was capped in the agreement. The first thing to point out is that when the agreement was put in place, they had well over 30 times the amount of material. That's not to say that we shouldn't be concerned over the 12. They also have not done 20% enrichment, but most important of all, the verification agreement is largely in place. And that is the key in the end of international confidence in their not having a weapons program. So I think that's interesting. However, what I think a lesson not yet one to be concluded is the extent to which they are prepared to turn down the temperature on these regional issues. I don't think we know that. So, and of course, they have their own presidential election coming up in June, which is going to be a big issue. So finally, what that leads me to think, and again, no guarantee the administration will think in the same way, but I think that there is no option other than to restarting a diplomatic thrust by putting back in place the JCPOA with full compliance all around. However, I don't think that it is politically reasonable or practical to go back to that as in any way the end state. When in 2015, at least my view was, and I think it was President Obama's view, was that the decision was made, take the nuclear threat off the table, build in 15 years of nuclear constraint, build in verification that has elements beyond that, including some forever, in the hope that over that 10 or 15 years, some level of trust could be rebuilt by, in fact, resolving some of those regional issues. If it didn't happen, the deal stood on its own. It accomplished what it wanted. It was not a deal built on trust. It was a deal built on verification and buying some significant time in the political life, at least, of the countries. However, I think right now we can't go back and just think, well, let's have patience and see if this all works out. So I believe personally that the JCPOA, going back, let me go back a step first. If you remember, before the JCPOA, there was an interim agreement. And the interim agreement laid out the parameters for succeeding negotiation in a fixed timescale. Perhaps returning to the JCPOA has to be viewed now as the interim agreement for reaching the next agreement in a fixed timescale, where some of these issues have to be addressed. But they're going to have to be addressed, not just the US and Iran. First of all, going back to the Europeans, Russia, and China are going to have to be on board, and Russia is probably particularly an issue there when you get to regional issues. And secondly, I believe in this to be successful, our allies in the Gulf, our Gulf allies and Israel are going to have to decide to play more in the discussions. Because this has to be, if it's going to be a regional solution, we have to have the regional players engaged. So, there was some discussion during the JCPOA negotiations. I think it's got to be raised to a whole new level going forward. Not easy, but that's my view of a path forward. You're on mute.
Thank you very much for this.
So our final panelist is David Brenner, who directs the Center for Radiological Research at the Medical Center, Columbia University Medical Center. And he is the Higgins Professor of Radiation Biophysics in Radiation Oncology and Environmental Health Sciences. He's also the director of the Radiological Research Accelerator Facility, which is founded by a student of Marie Curie more than a century ago, and which is committed to exploiting all forms of radiation to improve human health and medical care. So just to say that Dr. Moniz would have to exit at 1:15. So over to you, David.
Hey, thanks. Perhaps I'll comment a little bit about the health consequences of some of the scenarios we've been talking about. And for a large-scale nuclear event, I think what is generally agreed is the most likely scenario is not a government-based event, but an improvised nuclear device that comes from some terrorist group. And the sorts of events we're talking about there are not that dissimilar from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki type events, so that they're not huge world-ending events. They are completely disastrous events and events where people will die, but there are also events where an awful lot of people are going to be exposed and will not die. So we really need to think about being able to respond in a useful manner to that sort of type of event. And actually there is a pretty strong program at NIH, at NIAID, looking at that. Turning to lower doses, and now I'm thinking in the field of nuclear energy. I mean, one of the real limitations to the future development of nuclear energy is our lack of understanding of the effects of low levels of radiation. And that's a really difficult problem, trying to figure out what are the biological effects of low levels of radiation. We and many other people have been working on that for decades. And one issue which perhaps I might want to bring up here is that up till a decade ago, I mean, the major source of research and research funding was the DOE, low dose radiation program. And for reasons certainly that I don't understand and above my pay scale, that program died. And that's been a calamity, I would say, for the future of nuclear power, because if we really don't understand well the effects of low levels of radiation, we're going to have to spend far more than we need to on developing nuclear power to levels of safety that perhaps we don't need. So I might ask the Secretary what his views on the future of the low-level radiation program at DOE. You're muted.
I am muted.
You're muted.
Thank you. I was going to ask you what you think of the linear threshold hypothesis.
Well, it's something that needs to be researched more. I mean, I think it's probably the best we have at this moment, but there's a lot of weaknesses involved in it, and
Okay.
we need to probe those weaknesses.
Yeah, I must say I'm not sure I would personally use the word it's the best we have available, but it's the only thing we have available.
Yeah,
in terms of regulatory caution. But let me first go comment a little bit on your earlier statement. An improvised device is certainly an issue, but I just don't want to take off the table again this issue of state use of a nuclear weapon through misunderstandings and blunders and bad data, because again we have historical examples where we just barely dodged the bullet on that. But the terrorist, the improvised device is certainly a very important now a modern phenomenon for sure. But I'd also add, and I think you would agree, that it's not just a nuclear explosion, but a so-called dirty bomb of setting off with conventional explosives some radioactive sources and creating a real mess. As you may know, at NTI, we've had a big program with New York City in terms of eliminating cesium-137 sources to be replaced by X-ray technology because of the dirty bomb risks involved there. And the mayor's office, the public health part of the mayor's office was very, very helpful there. And pleased to say that we were making some traction elsewhere as well in terms of alerting people to the danger as quietly as we can, while pointing out that there are other technology options that would not provide these risks, like the X-ray technology. On the low dose radiation, you're certainly right, and frankly, the Office of Biological Environmental Research thought it was time to end that program. There was a lot of frustration over the lack of progress, frankly, I think in advancing that. But I completely agree with the importance of it. It is a critical issue throughout the nuclear enterprise that one has this certainly conservative, the question is how conservative, regulatory approach. I'll tell you what I think, and I'd love to get your reaction. I think a very promising direction in the low dose field would be to use the technology that's now being put in place. And this would be a huge program to execute, but the technology being put in place for what at least was called the cancer moonshot, starting in early 2016. And so the idea there, and I would say that actually to tie this to contemporary events, the president-elect today was then the vice president put in charge of the cancer moonshot program, and I went to him almost immediately with two people from the department experienced in the relevant areas, and said that applying very big data analytics and machine learning might be a very interesting new way of approaching cancer issues generally. I think that that could be a very interesting way specifically of addressing the low dose radiation issues. It would take an enormous database, of course, of exposures and trying to get it, trying to get them to be meaningful comparisons, et cetera, and then going through them with very big data techniques and machine learning. Maybe that's a way of trying to pick out that very small signal out of this very, very noisy background. So I don't know if that makes sense in the end, but it was always in the back of my mind that that might be a new tool to apply in the low dose arena.
Yeah, I would completely agree with you. It's a really powerful tool, but it's not the only tool we've got these days with modern molecular biology. So there are things that can be done. Sure.
I think actually that's I think revisiting the program at DOE in those dimensions would, I think, could bear fruit, because frankly the Congress is also very receptive to reviving that program.
Thank you.
There's help there. Right.
So I think that brings us to the end of Dr. Moniz's participation. Let me just say to you, Ernie, that there are two qualities that make this a real honor for me to moderate the session. The one quality is your quite breathtaking mastery of your subject matter. It's quite extraordinary. I'm sure that all the audience and panelists would all agree with that. And the second quality has to do with your deep experience in policymaking in an arena of one of the world's superpowers. And I think that combination of deep experience in policymaking and a mastery of a subject matter, I think was just fabulous. So I would like to thank you very much on behalf of Columbia University and all of us for your time and for your energy and for your insights and for your leadership in this field. So we are very grateful to you for your time.
Well, Wilmot, let me thank all of you for the opportunity to discuss here, but also I want to add to all of your colleagues my thanks to Wilmot, not just for moderating this, but for being a tremendous partner in another thing we do at NTI, which is the pandemic problem. And in fact, we have some major initiatives there, which we think can be consequential. And Wilmot has always been at the center of our activities there. So thank you for that so much, Wilmot. And let's solve that problem too.
No, thank you very much. So thanks again and go well.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye. And so, colleagues, I think that there are some really important questions in the chat box and the Q&A. And I'd like to send some of those in your direction to answer. The one question at the end was from somebody who said that the discussion focused as it has on the US and the Russia only, and that they're turning to nuclear negotiations with Russia. And the question was, does that mean that the US is not concerned about nuclear China? It's a question I would have loved to put to Dr. Moniz, but if I can put that to you, because clearly China is important, but let me not answer that question. I don't know whether any other panelists would like to respond to that.
Yes, let me start. That I said that I thought there weren't really high conflicts between US and Russia. Secretary Moniz thought I was somewhat optimistic and also worried correctly about accidental things. But when we look at US and China, the political conflicts are much, much greater, focused on the Taiwan Straits, South China Sea, general rivalries of China as a rising power. And China, as I think someone said in the chat correctly, until about 5 years ago, China's nuclear program had been amazingly restrained. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the Chinese nuclear explosion, 1964. All of us who were in the game, and I was working on these issues then as a graduate student, we expected China to follow the Soviet and American path of building large and diversified nuclear arsenals. It didn't. It built very small arsenals of only land-based missiles, about 200, I think even less, and didn't modernize it after that. That's changed now. And the dangers, and the US also China conflict is focusing really in the sea. The Taiwan, most obviously, the danger of pressure on Taiwan, less an out-and-out invasion, but pressure of various kinds. We've seen literally ships bumping in the South China Sea, a variety of things. Well, if armies are hard to control, navies are impossible. There's tremendous autonomy from every captain. I don't mean that these people are cowboys on either side or reckless or want a war, but the danger of actions taken for self-protection to lead to physical clashes is really quite great at sea. And the US has, of course, tried to bring China into the arms control discussions with the Soviet Union. I think initially this was done, I think, largely for propaganda reasons, but there were real reasons to do it. But it's very hard because of all the asymmetries. But the questioner is absolutely right that I worry much more about a nuclear exchange between China and the US than I do about Russia and the US, even though Russia has many more weapons than China does.
Thank you very much indeed, Bob, for that response. Here's a further question that goes as follows. With regards to the US's efforts in the Middle East, is it forbidden to consider Israel's nuclear disarmament as a component in any regional nuclear negotiations? Who would like to respond to that?
I can take that. So
excellent.
Well, let's start by from Israel's point of view. As far as I can tell, well, it is obvious that they never liked the JCPOA. They never believed in it. But it has become clear that the current situation is not better than what was under the JCPOA. I think that the nuclear is, thinking about Israel's program, nothing that will happen with Iran will change where Israel stands on the nuclear, on its own nuclear program. That is not part of the discussion. But it is going to be interesting, and that's the big unknown, how Israel will act between now and the time we're going back to diplomacy vis-a-vis Iran. And it is really hard to read from outside how Israel might want to push the United States to do, what actions they would want the United States to take at the moment, or what actions they would want to have green light from the United States to take unilaterally. That is important questions we don't know. And that goes back to the question that I posed to Secretary Moniz. What are the lessons that Israel learned from the first time, from the JCPOA? And are we going to see a repeat or a return to this kind of public diplomacy by Israel against another nuclear agreement, or are we going to see more actions that are taking, and we already see a lot of cyber attacks that are happening behind the scenes, and even escalation on that on that front. it's not clear. This is not a great moment for Israel to engage in any military activities against Iran, with the pandemic, with the domestic situation in Israel. But you never know. You cannot rule it out. So it is going to be complicated, and it is going to be interesting, especially as we go into the transition to the Biden administration. And then I think Israel will try to gauge what is the next president, what his approach, how different it's going to be from the first round, from the first time this administration negotiated the JCPOA. What role the Iran's new regional behavior are going, what part they're going to play, how they're going to think about sanctions and so on.
Thank you very much. There's a question that goes as follows. What, in your opinion, I suppose it was initially directed towards Dr. Moniz, what is your opinion on a feminist approach to foreign policies, including the nuclear armaments policy, like, for example, the Center of Feminist Foreign Policies is recommending? It's the broader question around eliminating nuclear weapons, and the question of women involved in conducting negotiations. So I pose that as a question to any of the panelists to answer.
Unfair to ask Keren to go first. So I'll go first and ask Keren to go second. There's a thriving field in international politics of feminist approaches. I want to stress approaches, because there isn't a feminist theory, and it's an enormous range. And most of those theories reject an essentialist approach. There's an essentialist approach that say women, due to, in a way, biology, nurturing, that they favor negotiations more than violence. They're better negotiators, they're more empathetic, they're more problem solving. Most feminist theorists reject that, although I actually think there's an argument to be made rooted in evolution for that, but let me put that aside. And we, of course, see that many female leaders behave, I think, indistinguishable from men. Now, currently, we're in pandemic, we point to the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who's handled it in perhaps a distinctive way, not unrelated to being a woman and a mother. But when we look at a lot of international issues, women like Margaret Thatcher, Indira Gandhi, Golda Meir come to mind. These are not exactly warm and fuzzies. I think it isn't the difference between men and women, but the basic question of whether a lot of our academic theories, and more importantly, the views held by political leaders and public opinion, whether those overweight force, so-called hard power, whether we have a, partly due to feelings of status, you have to be tough, whether most countries, not only Western perhaps, have overlooked possible paths to greater cooperation because they are excessively enamored with views that stress the need to make threats and to look tough.
I should just add, I agree completely with Bob. In terms of the studies, there are mixed results, right? We can't, and because there's a lot of issues about selection and small n and changes over time and what you're really capturing with these gender differences over time. So, the empirical record is mixed, but it shouldn't, the bigger point and the larger point is that as a woman who studied international security, as a woman who's now heading an institute in national security, I think that we as a field we have failed to incorporate more women, and we haven't done enough incorporating more women into this field. And a big part of what we're going to do with Saltzman, we're launching a program on national security and intelligence that is going to target and mentor, attract, inspire and train women and minorities in the field of international security, because this field needs more diversity, and we will all benefit from it. And again, the empirical record on women in decision making is mixed, and I'm happy to go into this. But in terms of values and it's in our interest to see greater diversity and inclusion of more women and minority into this field. They make a difference. It makes a difference.
Can I just dive in here as well, Wilmot?
Yeah, of course.
This is really interesting, but I think it's just a little bit unfair to compare some of the modern women leaders we have with Margaret Thatcher, who is from a different generation, where I kind of feel, part of what she had to do to succeed is to behave like a man. And I think nowadays we're actually seeing more and more astonishing women leaders in not just as prime ministers or presidents, but actually in government more generally, who are bringing something to the table that I think government desperately needs. And there's pretty good statistics on the response to the COVID crisis around the world that you see from where there's a woman leader or a very powerful female representation in government, compared with what happens where you don't have that. So I just think we shouldn't taint the opportunity there is before us now with comparisons with the way things were back in the 80s. So.
Yes, no, thanks for that, Alex. Let's just to say that there's a great deal to be learned from women who occupy and have occupied leadership positions in terms of the style that they bring to tough negotiations. There's a great deal to be learned from that, without reducing it to any kind of inherent biology. I think so there's some powerful lessons there. So thanks for those comments. I think this brings the seminar to an end, to say that I thought it was really absolutely fabulous, and that both our guest speaker and our panelists and my co-moderator Alex are real experts in the field, and the quality of the discussion was just quite outstanding, and dealing with a compelling, if not the most compelling, issue of our time. And we've arrived at this point in our history where peace is secured through control over the potential to annihilate the entire planet altogether, and that keeping that architecture in place is key to how we transition from today into the future. But that architecture has to be modernized, and that architecture has to deal with a changing configuration of who the key players are. So that's the task before us, and we all have a role to play in that, because it will take a monumental collective effort to get there. So to thank you very much, to thank the audience. There are still some outstanding questions. We'll do our best to answer those. I'd like to thank, as always, people behind the scenes who make this work. Hala Wang from ISERP, Mariana Palumbo from the Academy of Political Science, and Jennifer Ward from ISERP as well. Thank our partners at the Earth Institute, at the Vagelos College of Surgeons and Physicians, as well as the Academy of Science. And thank most of all our guests. I do want to say that our next event will be on December the 8th at 12:30. And we will have Farid Zakaria from CNN to discuss his new book, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World. And I think that is the slide. And on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for what you've done today. And enjoy the rest of your day or evening, depending on where you are. Thanks so much.